India, of course, is keen to use the talks to engage the Taliban on matters of security, which is where our prime interests lie. We certainly do not want Afghanistan to emerge as a theater which is conducive for breeding of actors that are inimical to the interests of the Indian state.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global for the Jays. This is Nayanima Basu. I have with me today Professor Raghav Sharma. He is the director for the Center of Afghanistan Studies, and he also teaches at the Center for the School of International Affairs at the Jindal University. Welcome to the Gist, Raghav, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me, Nayanima.
Thank you. So I know this was done on a very short notice, but as you are aware, the news is coming in that the Taliban Foreign Minister Muttaqi can finally be coming to India. The efforts have been going on since the beginning of this year, as you're very well aware. But how do you see this unprecedented move? Because when the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan years back in 2001, when the US-led invasion overthrew them, that time also India did not recognize. But do you see this as a kind of recognition?
I wouldn't say it's a step necessarily that is going to lead to recognition anytime soon, but certainly it's a calibrated ramping up of the relationship. This has been in the works, for quite some time. It eventually sort of may lead to recognition, but I think that's still a long way off because there are many other sticking points as far as recognition of the Taliban is concerned. So I don't see this as necessarily, the outcome leading to recognition, but certainly it's going to bolster ties and bolster the level of engagement between India and the Afghan Taliban. This, as you rightly pointed out, is the first ministerial level in-person engagement between India and the Taliban regime. We've had actually in person, we've only had ministerial engagement in the 90s when we didn't recognize the government, when basically Jaswant Singh had to engage the Taliban to secure the release of hostages from Kandahar over the course of the IC-814 hijacking. After that, the only ministerial contact we had was with Jaishankar in May 2025 against the backdrop of Operation Sindoor. In which, interestingly, if you look at the readouts of the Afghan Foreign Ministry and the MEA talked about the Taliban condemning terrorism, whereas the Afghan Foreign Ministry actually completely skipped references to terrorism. It said that we talked about visas, we talked about trade, we talked about medical visas, infrastructure. So yes, there is engagement, but I think both sides still have different areas that they want to prioritize in terms of talks. But it is certainly a calibrated ramping up of the relationship, and this is, as I said, this has been in the works for some time.
Right. So, well, we can see this kind of outreach reach is sort of happening from the beginning of this year, right? Foreign
Right.
Secretary was there in person meeting, of course, the Taliban foreign minister and others. Before that, little bit of outreach was going on when we had sent our former Joint Secretary, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran. Then, of course, Foreign Minister Jaishankar had a discussion with Muttaqi over phone, and Taliban was the first sort of in the neighborhood first one to condemn Pahalgam attack. So how do you see these little steps building onto something bigger? I know you are saying that recognition probably will not happen now, but what is it, what do you think is the immediate goal that both sides seek to achieve?
Well, as far as the Taliban is concerned, for one, this comes against the backdrop of some element of friction in the relationship between Taliban and Pakistan, something that's been festering for a while now. TTP, of course, is one issue, but there have also been border skirmishes. Just yesterday, there were reports of firing taking place along the border with Kunar province in Afghanistan between Pakistani forces and Afghan forces. So this certainly, one cannot underestimate the timing of the Taliban opposite. It's coming against the backdrop of, continued or persistent tensions with Pakistan, because the Taliban's return to power hasn't quite panned out in the way that the generals in Pindi would have wanted it to. It's they wanted to choreograph it in a completely different manner. It hasn't panned out in that way. For the Taliban, I think this visit is significant because it also helps them play to their domestic constituency and try and shore up their legitimacy, which opponents have often tried to undermine by saying that the Taliban are actually puppets of, Rawalpindi. They lack complete agency, and it's Rawalpindi which actually brought them into power. So here they are openly quoting India, saying that, look, we have our own agency, and we are free to quote who we think will best secure the interests of Afghanistan. So I think it will help politically play to the domestic gallery in Afghanistan. As far as India is concerned, I think India. From an Indian perspective, it signals what's been again in the making for the last 2 to 3 years, which is that India, has engaged in a pragmatic transactional relationship with the Taliban, like many other countries, recognizing that the Taliban actually, whether we like it or not, they are a political reality today. And they're a political reality because you don't really have any meaningful opposition to the Taliban. They are a reality because actually all major neighbors of Afghanistan today, which had kept the opposition to the Taliban going in the 90s, are no longer actually aligned with the opposition, including Tajikistan, which is very significantly watered down its opposition to the Taliban. They've handed over the consulate in Kharog to the Taliban. So I think India does realize that there are limitations to how much it can maneuver, and the political realities in the country have changed. And India needs to engage the Taliban in order to secure its interests. Securing state interests cannot be viewed always from the trope of morality or ethics. It's very often cold, calculated realpolitik, and this is pretty much at play here. India doesn't certainly want the Chinese and the Pakistanis to have a complete free run in its northwestern neighbor, where it's invested a significant amount of political, diplomatic, and financial capital. But engagement is only one sort of piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more that India will eventually have to do if it wants, if it really wants its presence to acquire meaningful traction and heft in the Afghan theater. So this is one step towards that, and I think the Afghans are looking certainly to have India address the issue of visas, which has been a long pending demand of the Afghans for medical treatment and for education. They are keen essentially to explore avenues to bump up trade with India, which is, over the years emerged as a good market for many of the Afghan products. Currently, we only have the air corridor. Pakistan remains a hurdle. We were hoping to circumvent that through the INSTC, the Chabahar port, but that, as you know, has now come under renewed sanctions from the Trump administration. So that's another thing that's been complicated. India, of course, is keen to use the talks to engage the Taliban on matters of security, which is where our prime interests lie. We certainly do not want Afghanistan to emerge as a theater which is conducive for breeding of actors that are inimical to the interests of the Indian state. The Taliban have had a history of being in bed with such actors. They haven't severed ties with such actors even now. We know that for a fact. I mean, after all, Ayman al-Zawahiri was taken out by the Americans in Kabul in a guest house that was owned by people in the regime, high up in the regime, and it's hard to believe they wouldn't know he's there. There are a plethora of other groups that are operational in Afghanistan, but India would be more concerned about groups like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's Indian subcontinent branch, they are certainly concerned about the fact that there are certainly elements within the Taliban that have sympathy for groups like the Lashkar, the Jaish, which have specifically focused on India. So we certainly don't want a situation where we have no leverage and no channel essentially to engage the regime of the day. These actors pop up over there.
So, do you think that this is, although recognition, as you are saying, is a long term this thing, but end of the day, there is also a call from the Taliban side to appoint kind of envoy, an ambassador here, something like what China has done. I mean, not really giving a full recognition, so to say, but at least have ambassadors in each other's capitals so that the work goes on, right? And also
Yes.
coming to the presence that you are talking about, that China and Pakistan cannot have a free run there. uh, do you think that this is then probably also the time for India to restart the projects, because that's what the Taliban had also been talking about? Also, I'll ask another question, because this is also coming up from some of our Western allies, is the fact that why is India silent on some of the regressive policies that the Taliban has unleashed there, especially on women education, and how we've stayed away from the UN resolution, right, in July. So how do you really analyze from an expert's point of view?
That's a bunch of loaded and very interesting questions. I was actually coming to the point in the ambassador. Yes, the Taliban, not now, for quite some time, they've been actually pressing India to allow a representative of the Taliban to take charge of the embassy. That has partially, that process has been set rolling because we've appointed an Afghan student who's running the consulate in Mumbai, and he's reporting to the foreign ministry in the Taliban. And I'm sure that's going to be very much on the agenda of the talks, because the Taliban are keen to kickstart, a full-fledged control of diplomatic missions in India, because India is an important country for them, both politically and economically. For the reasons that I outlined earlier. So that is something that they'd be looking essentially to kickstart. That is to have ambassadorial level representation. It is also going, while it's not going to lead to a formal recognition, it's certainly going to bolster the level of Taliban's engagement. It's going to bolster their ambition and their and a confidence in their ability to eventually work towards the goal of recognition. Having ambassadors present their credentials and having them present in each other's capitals means that it's certainly going to bolster their resolve to work towards the end goal, which is international recognition, which is what they are vying for. So I think that's very much going to be on the agenda for the talks, even if it's not formally acknowledged. So we may actually, not immediately, but at least sometime thereafter, see some movement on that front. I think it's a very apt time to restart projects. And as I said, that if India wants to add traction and meaningful heft to its presence, there are many. There's actually a demand both at the level of the government, but also at the level of the people, that India actually restart some of its key humanitarian projects in Afghanistan, particularly in the field of medicine and rural rehabilitation, two areas where our projects actually got very good press and did some good work. I think the time is right, because the Taliban also keen to look to sources other than the West to support the reconstruction of the country, which is emerging from decades of conflict. And we certainly may not like the Taliban; they're unsavory characters, but the reality is that the levels of violence have gone down, and they've gone down because the perpetrators of violence are in power.
Mhm.
And this has allowed unprecedented access to very large pockets of rural Afghanistan that had been cut off from prospects of meaningful development, meaningful interventions in the humanitarian sector, because they were inaccessible because of conflict. And what we are seeing is that there is a humanitarian crisis, because the US aid has cut very large tranches of funding that has rendered, for instance, healthcare access to women almost non-existential in many parts of the country. It's going to eventually lead to a public health crisis in our neighborhood, which I think it would do us well to actually intervene in sectors like health. I mean, there are a bunch of refugees that the Pakistanis have forcefully repatriated, as have the Iranians. And it would again be an interesting point to actually look at, that what can India do to actually assist this large repatriation of refugees, which is going to have both a humanitarian but also a political dimension to it.
Right.
um, what can we do to support education And education shouldn't just be looked at from a humanitarian perspective, because remember, we're also talking about restarting visas, but the larger concern that will loom on the minds of many of our policymakers would be that in the long run, 5-7 years from now, when kids from these schools graduate and they aspire to higher education degrees outside, the challenge is going to be that they're not going to come out with the values and the curriculum that existed during the period of the Republic. The curriculum has changed. What we've also seen is a proliferation of madrasas. So there's also the challenge of radicalization that is not going to stay within Afghanistan. And I'm not saying that should be a reason to not give visas, but this is something we really need to think about and see how can we meaningfully intervene in the education sector under these very difficult circumstances to support not just education but also good education for Afghans. And the last 20 years, if one thing that they've demonstrated is that education has been a very potent force for good social change in Afghanistan. This is not the Afghanistan of the 90s that the Taliban were dealing with. And India has managed to create very large constituencies of goodwill, both amongst the people and amongst the elite, via education. Remember, even today under the Taliban, very large sections of the Afghan bureaucracy are manned by people who were educated or trained in India. So that's one area again we should be looking at to acquire attraction. The last point that you, I think, very importantly flagged was India's silence. Um, Yes, I mean, India's silence is, in a sense, deafening. We've not even spoken up for people like Matiullah Vesa, for instance, who were educated in India and campaigned very extensively and in a non-political manner for women's right to access education. There's been a deafening silence, and that is because I think, um, you know, we certainly would be at unease with the Taliban's policies on women. But I think there's also a realization that India, has very limited leverage when it comes to dealing with the Taliban. We don't have geographical contiguity with Afghanistan, unlike Pakistan or Iran, which makes them, whether we like it or not, it makes them very consequential players in the Afghan theater. We are not a permanent veto wielding member of the UNSC, unlike the Chinese or the Russians, and we are not certainly a military power like the United States. So our options are, the basket of options that we have are limited. Also, India doesn't want to be seen as being very preachy like the West on issues of human rights, women's rights, saying, well, this is something which is an internal matter, let the Afghans sort it out themselves. Our interest simply is to ensure that we don't have to face challenges of radicalization. We don't have to deal with, a bunch of non-state actors who are going to harm us. So let's stick to that. Let the Afghans sort this out themselves. So I think it's been a very cold, calculated kind of approach, saying that we simply don't have the leverage. But while it's true that India has been silent, what's also very striking, Nayanima, is that you look at the European Union, which engaged in very loud rhetoric on these issues 2 years ago, or even the United States. All of that, seems to have suddenly petered out. It's been watered down very significantly, which again shows, how human rights and women's rights are not completely apolitical. They're not high on the political agenda, and therefore they also don't find much resonance. That's the unfortunate reality.
Mhm. So, if I can also ask you, Professor Sharma, I mean, yes, what you talked about, why India did not take a stand, but then that was also the question that India used to be one of the, in South Asia, the the topmost aid giver to Afghanistan, right? Before, of course, the Taliban came in. But now the question also remains that in 2021, when the Taliban came in, India had this knee-jerk reaction, right? Revoking all the visas, not letting the students come in who had valid visas, and they lost their academic years. And probably they could never join the universities for which they were, they properly got the admission for. We even stopped, medical tourism and all of that. But so now that we are trying to bring the relationship back on track, although we never had a relationship, so to say, with the Taliban, but probably we are now realizing that this is the reality. Uh, Let me just ask you an immediate question. What do you think could be the deliverables when the foreign minister of Afghanistan, and it's still an interim foreign minister, right? It's an interim
Right.
government in Kabul. So when he comes in, what do you think could be the deliverables that both these capitals can discuss?
Deliverables, would be for the Afghans, they'd be interested in India giving assurances and not just announcing the issuance of visas, something we did in April 2025, but actually start acting on the business of issuing visas. We haven't really acted on issuing the visas to the Afghans. Hardly any visas have been issued. That is a very important, and I think to a certain extent a genuine priority that the Afghans have. Um, Second, trade, I think, is the other area, which is a key deliverable that the interim government, Taliban government, would be keen to look at. Because remember, levels of trade have shown a secular increase, not just with India, but with other neighboring countries ever since the Taliban have come to power. And they're keen to bump up trade because this will mean more access to diverse markets for the Afghans, other than Pakistan and Iran, on which the Afghans have been traditionally dependent. But remember, trade is also a very important source of revenue for the Afghan state, both under the Republic and the Taliban. So this is going to help the trading community. But again, this is not going to be easy to work around because of sanctions on Chabahar and the fact that the Afghan banking sector remains largely impeded by international sanctions. The Afghanistan bank which is run by the Taliban, is locked out of many financial institutions owing to sanctions. So trade, I think, is another key deliverable that they'll be looking at. Third would be a representation at the ambassadorial level. This is certainly something the Taliban are going to push for, because after all, this is a ministerial visit, and they'd want both India and Afghanistan, would want certain key deliverables that they'd be able to show, rather than just the foreign minister coming here for optics. The visit would have to have some substance. They could potentially, from India's perspective, also be discussing, even if it's not officially acknowledged, counterterrorism cooperation, intelligence sharing, on issues of narcotics, and perhaps on groups like the Daesh.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, J&K, ever since the Taliban's returned to power, there's been an uptick in night vision devices that are being smuggled in, that have been recovered from terrorists. So, security issues such as pilferage of small arms and light weapons, night vision devices, the challenges of radicalization are certainly going to be on the agenda.
Mhm. Now, if I can ask you, and we need to also wrap up the conversation, I know you have to go. If you can give us a glimpse and understanding of what really is happening between Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? End of the day, we've seen years after years, studies after studies, that no matter how much they fight, they will kind of, be allies, so to say. And India would be the outlier there. So how intense do you think is this tension? And do you think this is going to be long term, of which India can really take opportunity?
Look, the Pakistan-Taliban relationship is not a black and white relationship. It was not a black and white relationship in the 90s. It is not a black and white relationship today. Certainly, the Taliban have been instrumental in many ways in the rise of the Taliban, both in the 90s and subsequently, as an insurgent actor against NATO. There is no doubt about that. There are shared linkages that bind Taliban groups like the Taliban and the state of Pakistan. There are linkages of geography. There's linkages of ethnicity. There are economic linkages. Groups like the Haqqanis have business interests in Pakistan. Many ministers in the interim cabinet of the Taliban have Pakistani Shinakti cards, identity cards. Their families are based in Pakistan. They have businesses in Pakistan. So, that linkage is going to be there, which is going to give Pakistan ample room to maneuver. And these are leverages that they enjoy, which we do not. And I think we have to recognize and acknowledge that is an advantage that Pakistan has. But having said that, the relationship is, it's a relationship which has also seen the Afghans refuse to cede ground to Pakistanis. So there are core issues on which they will not cede ground to Pakistan. They will not cede ground, for instance, on the issue of the Durand Line, which is a touchy
Mhm.
historical
Right.
issue for many reasons. And we don't have the time to get into the historical nitty-gritty of that. They will not cede ground on issues of water sharing, which is a political hot potato. They will not cede ground on, cracking the whip on groups like the TTP, because that is going to invite its own backlash from within the constituency that the Taliban caters to. So there are core issues on which they will not cede ground. And if you look at actually accounts of many ideologues and leaders of the Taliban, whether it's Wakil Ahmed Mutawakil, whether it's Abdul Salam Zaif, whether it's Abdul Hai Mutamain, uh, you know, they they give a fairly unsavory picture of their dealings with the Pakistanis. In fact, Amir Khan Muttaqi, one shouldn't forget, was tossed into prison by the Pakistanis when he tried to open
Yes.
dialogue with the Americans with Hamid Karzai in 2010. The moment the Pakistanis got wind of it, they essentially picked him up and tossed him into jail, and he was only pulled out of jail at Donald Trump's insistence when he wanted to open talks with the Taliban in Doha. So, the Pakistanis have also cracked the whip on the Taliban when they felt that they were falling out of line, so to speak. So it's a relationship which is not black and white. There are many shades of gray in that relationship. So we will see tension in the relationship on issues of refugees. Why is Pakistan repatriating thousands of Afghan refugees suddenly? They say, well, you don't act on the TTP, you don't recognize the Durand line. We also have areas where we can crank up pressure on you. So yes, we will see friction. I think it's likely to persist because the ideological challenge for Pakistan is fairly large. But I think there are going to be areas of cooperation as well, and we have to recognize the fact that there are going to be limitations to how much we can maneuver based on this relationship, which has shades of gray, so to speak.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sharma. That was, giving us a lot of understanding as to what to expect from the upcoming visit. So that was Professor Raghav Sharma. He is the director for the Center of Afghanistan Studies at the Jindal Universities. And you are watching this interaction on the JIS for StratNews Global.